aware that any questions or comments you have, please put it in the chat, because only panelists will have the chance to speak via video. You can pose your questions in English, Spanish, Portuguese, and in German. And at this occasion, I very much would like to thank, on the one hand, Anja Apper from the KOO, who organized this webinar, and also the Austrian mission to the UN in Geneva, who provided us with this web platform to share this webinar with all of you. Thank you very much to both of you. So today we will focus on two very different regions, on two different continents, with peoples living under different conditions, but they all suffer from the same threat: greed for resources under their feet. Greed is fueled by a neoliberal and exploitatory economic system called capitalism, spread nearly all over this planet, leaving its obstructive traces everywhere without respect for people, the habit, and the natural system. It's up to us not to wait until the time everybody and everything is exhausted, and this webinar shall be a kind of building block towards to an economic system that respects people, nature, and the planet. So our goal of today is to learn about the situation of indigenous people and local communities, especially at the Amazon region, and of the African Kolwezi copper cobalt belt, and show that protecting people, protecting nature, biosystems, and climate is one and the same as to protect the right of people to live in a healthy environment, because that is a human right. So we will try to show ways how civil society and parliamentary structures can cooperate to meet this goal by thinking human rights and environmental protection as one single concept, and raising awareness for the fact that one part of humanity enjoys a relatively good life on the cost, and part. Often those in the north who have a quite better life, and those in the south who suffer from the results of these better lives of a few. So we will have two blocks of input divided by regions, and I would like to start with Brazil. And there I'm very happy, good morning to you, to welcome Chantelle Teixeira. She is lawyer at CIMI. CIMI is, excuse my Portuguese, the Conselho Indigenista Missionário in the states of Amazonas and Roraima. She herself is located in the south of Brazil, and the focus of her work is providing legal training and to local indigenous communities about territorial rights and consultation under ILO conventions. ILO is the International Labour Organization. So, Chantelle, please, over to you.
Hi, Petra. Thanks. Hi, everyone. It's an honor speaking in this webinar with such a necessary theme, while our economical and social model becomes so destructive for our planet. We need to listen to the voice of the people of the forest. My English conversation skills are not that good, which doesn't allow to me to be spontaneous. So I wrote a paper to try to explain my points, and I wrote to be understood. I want to share my slides, and yes, well, over the last few decades, The indigenous peoples of the Amazon have been widely acknowledged in international debate platforms where topics such as carbon emissions, climate change, and the uncertain future of our planet are discussed for their valuable contribution to what the general public usually calls preservation of nature, preservation of the environment, and of biodiversity. The indigenous people's reputation as protectors of nature has its raison d'être. In fact, within the limits of the 381 indigenous lands in Brazilian Amazon that are already demarcated or in the process of being officially recognized, the deforested areas in 2020 corresponded to only 1.4% of the total land extension, while outside the indigenous lands, the deforested areas covered above 20% of the total land surface, according to the Brazilian National Institute for Space Research. The federal government of Brazil, who in recent years has been deliberately and drastically reducing the budget destined for monitoring and policing actions to be developed by the state-owned indigenous agents FUNAI, to the point of leaving it inoperative, can take credit for the preservation of indigenous forests. This credit is it's the on contrary due to the indigenous peoples themselves who, in the absence and the omission of states, assumed the defense of their territories themselves. It's interesting, however, that is precisely the non-existence in the cosmologies of the Amazonian indigenous peoples of a concept of nature as assemblage of being seen as objects or resource objects or resource susceptible for being managed, which makes them assume their role as defenders or guardians of the forest. The belief of the Amazonian indigenous peoples that plants, animals, waters, and minerals have spirit owners, see themselves as persons, and these sense have to be recognized as historical and political subjects, makes them recognize more easily our need to live in harmony with them. And their historical aversion towards the idea of private land ownership based on the belief that no one should be able to own things that he himself didn't create, motivates them to fight to have the national government demarcating their traditional territories in order to ensure that these territories continue to be a public lands in the full sense of term, lands that can be used collectively by their communities, ensuring good living and health for all. For more than 3 decades now, the Brazilian indigenous peoples, being aware of the genocidal and ecocidal effects of the non-indigenous peoples' thirds of goods, have been organizing themselves locally and forging superregional political alliances and networks to empower themselves and their struggle against the destruction of their ancestral lands. And they have made more and more public pronouncements, petitions, and complaints in the international area before the UN and the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, where they called the international community to take measures that contribute to the guarantee on their constitutional rights in the context of attack on them by the federal government of Brazil. Complaints present by representatives of Amazonian indigenous peoples to international organisms over the last decades show the capitalist society's unbridled questions of natural resource and resulted in serious violation of rights and caused severe impacts of the livelihood of traditional communities. Current examples from Brazil would be The exponential increase in illegal logging in indigenous lands such as terras indígenas Araribóia, Arara, Tubarão, Latundê, and Sepoti. Around 35% of terra indígena Araribóia territory has already been completely devastated by illegal loggers. Illegal land allotment and deforestation for cattle ranching and agriculture purposes in indigenous land, such as terras indígenas Itunatatá, Caripuna, and Urueuauau. Licensing process of construction of roads, hydroelectric plants, and power lines done without free, prior, and informed consultation, affecting indigenous lands such as terras indígenas Waimiri-Troari, Raposa Serra do Sol, Tenharim Marmelos, and others. According to the annual survey conducted by CIMI in 2018, over 8% of the 122 cases of repossession conflicts, illegal natural resource exploitation, and extensive damage to indigenous property were registered in legal Amazon. This kind of illegal activity doesn't only cause internal conflicts in the indigenous communities, but also it exposed the indigenous people to serious health problems and direct physical violence. 90% of all the Yanomami people have high levels of mercury contamination in the blood, and during the pandemic, invaders became a relevant vector of contamination by the coronavirus amidst indigenous peoples. The report Rural Conflicts Brazil 2019 shows that number of rural conflicts during the first year of Bolsonaro's government is the highest in the last 5 years. In this context, there were 9 murders of indigenous peoples, 7 of them being leaders, which demonstrate a selective violence practice with the intention of intimidating and discouraging the communities. The inter-American and universal systems of the protection of human rights by means of international treaties and judgments do recognize the particular importance that their territories have for indigenous peoples. In this sense, states have to recognize the indigenous people's collective rights to their territories. And to that end, must adopt mechanisms and instruments for their normal recognition. The Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, in its report on the situation of human rights of the indigenous and tribal peoples of the Pan-Amazon region, stated that the recognizing of the right of self-determination constitutes a fundamental premise for the exercise for the human rights of the indigenous people, above all, the rights of their territories and natural resources. The resistance of political force and the imposition of a predatory and environmentally unsustainable economic model in place, increasing challenge for the implementation of the coordinated policies for the protection of indigenous territories, their natural resource, and especially the indigenous communities that are their guardians. Although Brazil has its national policies for the protection of the human rights defenders, the number of the murders and territorial conflicts involving indigenous peoples in the country has been growing at an alarming rate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chantelle, for these insights, which are of course very shocking. And we all know that the combination of the exploitative economic model in Brazil, in combination with a quite irresponsible policy on COVID, is something that some people would call ethnic cleansing towards indigenous people. Yeah, thank you very much for giving this insight. I would like to move on to Anna Cavazzini. She is a German member of the European Parliament for the Greens, and she is vice chair of the Parliament's Brazil delegation. One of her focuses in parliamentary work is to changing the trade policy and make it more fair and sustainable and more in line with the Green Deal and its goals. So Anna, I'm sure you can very informed respond on what we just heard from Chantelle.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation, and also Petra for the introduction. I hope you can hear me well, because also in Germany we often have internet problems. I mean, I deal a lot with Brazil and with the indigenous communities there, but always, again, when I hear reports like now from Chantelle, I'm like shocked and angry. And we are really at the moment in the European Parliament try to put an emphasis on what's happening in the Amazon region, because, as you could hear from Chantelle really firsthand, the problems are increasing. And of course, as we know, the difficult situation for indigenous people in the Amazon region is not a new thing. Extraction of resources and the destruction of nature and biodiversity and also climate change have been around for several years. But of course, with the government of Bolsonaro, it really worsened, because I can just summarize it again what Chantelle said. Like, a lot of environmental policy got dismantled by Bolsonaro. The oversight structure for protecting the Amazon got dismantled. Penalties for illegal fires got abolished. A lot of funding for environmental protection got decreased or completely abolished. And I can basically go on and go on with that list. The European Parliament in 2018, this was basically before I was elected. I'm a recently elected MEP from May last year. 2018, the European Parliament, also with a lot of pressure from us Greens, voted the first ever resolution on indigenous people, and there is actually very good and strong demands in it. For example, of course, a very strong demand of respecting the rights of territory and their land, urging all EU member states to ratify the ILO Convention number 169 on indigenous people and tribal people. And very important, and this is exactly my angle I'm working on, demanding that all trade and investment and development policies coming from the European Union should respect the rights of indigenous and also include them in all the decision-making processes when it comes to economic decisions and economic activities of EU companies in the Amazon region or in other regions of the world. Also, of course, a very important demand in this resolution is the transparency and accountability of land acquisitions by EU actors in third countries. So I would say the resolution of this parliament is very strong, of our parliament is very strong and can give us a good hook to work with, and that's what we're trying to do. What is also interesting, in May 2017, the Council, so basically all the EU member states, also decided on some Council conclusions, repeating a little bit similar things, respecting or asking all member states and the EU itself to respect the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So on policy level and on rhetoric level, there is already got some good things happening at the EU. There is, of course, also human rights dialogues of the European Union, and there is a lot of EU funds going to human rights defenders and human rights activities. But what I think is still lacking and what is not working so well is indeed implementing what the European Parliament is asking and having a better control of our economic activities in those regions, for example, in the Amazon. We see that also a lot of companies that are active there are in fact EU companies and often directly or indirectly contribute to deforestation and to pressure in the Amazon region. Secondly, the European Union is at the moment, as you know, about to conclude a free trade agreement with the Mercosur country, which to our opinion will still increase the pressure on deforestation because it will increase the agricultural exports from the Mercosur country to the EU. And of course, as we all know, the products like ethanol or beef or whatever have to be like planted somewhere. And of course, then the pressure on the Amazon to our mind will still increase without having like binding and enforceable safeguards in the agreement. There is nice language on indigenous people, there is nice language on human rights, but at the end you cannot really enforce this nice language in the agreement. Thirdly, the EU, as you know, is of course also a huge importer of products coming from deforestation all over the world, but especially also in Brazil. And a lot of parliamentarians in the European Parliament, we have actually a social democratic rapporteur on a report just being discussed in our environment committee, is asking for basically due diligence in products linked to deforestation and also basically deforestation-free supply chains. I have initiated a debate in the European Parliament like 3 or 4 weeks ago in the plenary that talks about deforestation in the Amazon region, which is of course very, very linked to the rights of the indigenous. And the commissioner, our environment commissioner, was present in the plenary and announced a legal instrument for next year that will basically guarantee deforestation-free supply chains. So at least this is the announcement. So basically, for a start, I would like stop here so that I don't talk too much, but I try to give you an overview a little bit of the problems, but also of what the EU and especially the Parliament is doing at the moment. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anna. I think what you have mentioned is the concept of policy coherence for sustainable development, which is a concept everybody says, yes, how important it is, but we still miss concrete political measures how to fulfill this concept. And same is in the EU and what you told now. I got one particular question for Chantelle, saying, and Chantelle herself mentioned in her introduction the demarcation of territorial land, of traditional territories. And the question is, somebody read that most of the legal recognition procedures for indigenous land have not yet been carried out. Who owns the land for so long, the federal state or the state? Are these processes therefore being dragged out in order to exploit the land? So maybe you can elaborate a little bit who takes the decisions about what happens to land. Unmute yourself, please. Switch on your microphone. Yeah.
I think I understand the question, but can I respond in Portuguese or in English? Have to be in English?
If it's fine, you can respond in Portuguese and Tiago will give us a translation in English. It's no problem, but not too quick. Tiago, can you tell us, would you like to summarize at the very end, or will you try to translate?
I will try speaking in English, but it's the federal state that can recognize the lands of the indigenous peoples, but the right it already exists in our constitution. In the Constitution of Brazil, the rights of the indigenous peoples about their lands, it's originary. It's and a right anterior, a right that is prior than the existence of the Brazil. But it's a competence, it's a function of the governmental federal, the governed federal to recognize, to put the limits at the lands. And it's most about 60% the lands are recognized in Brazil. Just in the state of Amazon, there are 200 lands without provisos. No.
Provisions.
Provisions. There are no provision in the process of the demarcating the territories.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know.
Thank you very much. It was totally understandable, no problem at all. And I have another question for you. How do indigenous people handle the pandemic, facing the missing medical assistance from the central state?
Well, bien. Eu vou responder em português. Can I respond in Portuguese? Os povos indígenas têm tomado medidas autônomas, como isolado os seus territórios, né, não permitindo que outras pessoas possam adentrar neles. Tem usado muito dos seus tratamentos tradicionais, mas a primeira medida é de isolamento, é de não permitir que pessoas estranhas, que não indígenas, possam ingressar nos seus territórios. Mas
give Tiago a chance to translate this part before you continue, please.
Yeah, so the indigenous community has been taking autonomous decisions as to how to better protect themselves. And the first and most important one is to isolate themselves from outsiders. So if you're not an indigenous person or there is no relation with the community, you are not allowed to enter the community.
Exato, porque as medidas do governo estão muito aquém, são medidas muito pontuais e que muitas vezes foram os próprios profissionais de saúde do governo quem levaram a Covid para dentro das terras indígenas.
Yes, the measures from the federal government have been very less than ideal. And in some cases, the government professionals of health professionals are the ones who ended up bringing the COVID-19 into those communities.
Okay, thank you very much. Anna, do you have anything to add on that two questions? But I think it was much more to the resource person in the region. It's fine, okay. So I also would like to raise one other question I got, is in particular to Brazil, and that's how civil society organizations can uphold the pressure to fight for rights for indigenous people. So what civil society measure or power could be useful, could be helpful to maintain or gain human rights of indigenous people? You are both asked to answer on that.
I can start if you want, and then Chantelle can think about the language. And I actually also saw another question in the chat, and probably you can just combine it, because it's also very much connected. The question in the chat is about the chances of the Mercosur agreement being ratified during the German presidency. As you probably know, at the moment, Germany has for half a year the Council presidency, and in their program, but also kind of officially, they said one of their big goals in trade policy is to conclude the Mercosur agreement, and it is actually on the Council agenda beginning of November. At the moment, there is some technical discussions about if the Council needs anonymity vote or a majority vote. It depends if the agreement is split or not. It's a little bit complicated, but basically we don't know yet what are the voting majority procedures in the Council. And I would say if it's anonymity, it's very, very unlikely that it will pass, because several countries, including Austria, like Petra's country, but also France, the Netherlands and other countries have already announced like severe criticism of the agreement. And also I would say in the European Parliament, we never had a vote on the Mercosur agreement, not even like a non-binding resolution. At the moment, we don't know how the majorities are, but a lot of MEPs, also including the Conservatives, for example, that usually are really for free trade agreements, are critical because of the situation in the Amazon. And I think also really the civil society and also a lot of indigenous groups have made a really, really good campaign already in the last year and the last 2 years to draw attention to the really difficult situation. And when I'm in my constituency in Eastern Germany, I have the feeling everyone knows about the Amazon situation at the moment, because there was a lot of media attention, a lot of campaigning going on. And I think this is really also the good work that civil society should keep up. I think the Mercosur agreement, as bad as it is really a chance also to draw attention to the situation of the indigenous peoples in Brazil. And I think with every decision that Bolsonaro is taking is really noted here, is really big in the press. So I think this is already really good. We tried to get also economic pressure going, and you have probably seen that also, like, some investors threatened to withdraw their money from Brazil if this land grabbing law is passing through, legalizing land grabbing is going through. We have started together with Campact, a very big civil society organization in Germany, also like a petition saying that if this land grabbing law passes the Brazilian Congress, then German supermarkets should boycott products from Brazil. So I think it's also always good to go via the economic pressure, because at the end, I think this is the only language that Bolsonaro understands.
The boycott question I would like to keep for the discussion, because it really is relevant for both countries or for both regions. But I think it's important to discuss that as well. Maybe Chantelle, would you like to elaborate a little bit on the question of how to improve pressure of civil society to save indigenous lives? And you can do it in Portuguese as well if you want to.
Sim, bom, o que Ana fala sobre essa consciência sobre os produtos que nós compramos, de entender as suas origens, é um caminho da sociedade pressionar as empresas que estão desmatando a Amazônia e financiando isso. Mas eu penso que no Brasil as terras indígenas, elas são bens públicos, e então deveria existir uma consciência social da importância do seu reconhecimento como se fosse uma proteção de bens que são dos povos indígenas, mas que também são nossos, né? Também são das atuais e das futuras gerações. Acho que ter essa consciência de que as terras indígenas são importantes para o nosso futuro, para preservar a nossa sociedade brasileira, que é multiétnica e multicultural, é necessário.
Tiago?
Yes, so there has to be a social conscience from the companies who extract and utilize products from the Amazon. And more than that, there has to be social conscience from within the civil society that the indigenous lands are, it's a common, how can I put it? It's like a common good of the Brazilian society that belongs to everyone, not only to the current generation, but also the future generations or the generations to come. So there has to be a way that this social conscience is created and developed among Brazilian society, not to just view it as it's indigenous thing. No, it belongs to everyone, not only to indigenous peoples. It's something that should be protected by everyone.
Okay, and that's a key to raise awareness of everybody, and also to gain solidarity among the whole people of Brazil, right? Okay. So as I do not see any other questions to this part, I would like to move to the next one and invite Cristina Duranti. She is Global Director of the Good Shepherd International Foundation, which is a non-profit organization working in 35 countries with the focus to protect children and to empower women. Cristina is based in Rome, and I'm happy to hear from you about especially about the Colvesi copper cobalt belt and the problems there, problems of people and of nature.
Thank you very much, Petra, and thank you to the organizers for this invitation. As Petra said, my foundation works in support of the mission of the Good Shepherd Sisters in 35 countries, from Latin America to Asia Pacific. What I would like to share with you today, it's a project that we are supporting in DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and specifically in this area that we call copper cobalt belt, which is located in what was known back in the day as Katanga, and now has been divided into various provinces. I think the world should know where Katanga is, because historically, from World War I up until today, the most precious minerals that have fueled the global economy and the wars and the development from going to the moon to the mobile technology come from this particular area of the world. So the problems I'm going to discuss with you today are not new. They are to some extent different from what Chantelle has shared with us, because we are looking at a very, very close connection, and today this is much more visible, between the violations of human rights of local communities, as we refer to for the people who live at the upstream of this global supply chain of minerals, and the impact that this has on the global economy. This is becoming particularly interesting, and I'm going to show you a few slides for the global economy, because it's touching on a very controversial and very, I would say, hot topic, which is the Green Revolution. So you might or might not know, because this is a little bit less well known than the drama of the Amazon, that to build the batteries that fuel our e-economy, our electric economy, we need materials that are fairly rare, scarce, and most of them come from this very limited area in the world, the province of Lualaba in DRC. And I refer more specifically to one mineral you might have heard of, which is cobalt, that has become one of the most coveted commodities on the planet. And you have to think that it is estimated that around 70% of the global supply of this specific mineral, which is essential to modern lithium-ion batteries, comes from this very limited portion of land. What happens is that very recently, 5-6 years ago, some researchers and advocacy groups, particularly I refer to Amnesty International, went into Kolwezi and started to investigate what happens at the upstream of these supply chains. There was a lot of difficulty in understanding what are the dynamics happening in such a very long and complex supply chain. You might be all aware, since most of you are members of parliament, that a few years ago, the US has passed the so-called Dodd-Frank act that empowered also civil society and advocacy groups to look a little bit closer into companies' financial statements and asking questions on the origin of raw materials that they were using in their manufacturing supply chain. That was mostly, it was only focused on DRC, which was lucky from our end because the problem of minerals, and in that case it was connected to conflict minerals, was brought to light. Now, we'll get a little bit later on the legislation component. Now, I would like to bring you to what's happening at the moment in this remote part of the world that no one would know anything about if it wasn't for this specific precious commodity. And as I said, we are now very interested in what's happening there. I would say that the international community, and particularly the global business community, is very interested in what happens there, because this is a strategic area for the development of batteries and of electric vehicles. So there is a huge attention and stress on companies, especially the automotive sector, but also the consumer electronics sector, on human rights violations that have been documented happening at the upstream of the supply chain. And when we talk about human rights violations, we're not just referring to environmental damage that happens at the upstream, and it's related to the extractive operations, which in DRC happen in, let's call it, two main ways. One is the large industrial scale mining operation, which is the traditional imagery that we have on how mining happens. And to some extent, we would expect to be more regulated and more accountable towards communities, governments, and international community. But there's also a very large component that it's the so-called artisanal mining way of extracting minerals. And you see here in this picture a representation of what this artisanal mining means in this specific part of the DRC, where it's extremely unregulated, and it's left really to a very anarchic system of organization. Actually, these two sectors are very much intertwined for a number of reasons. The most important one being very weak capacity or will from the local government to regulate either sectors. And so there's a lot of gray areas where large scale mining, artisanal mining are intersecting and generate a lot of the impact on human rights and environment that you can see here. What we have observed as Good Shepherd International Foundation when our sisters first arrived now almost 10 years ago in Kolwezi to start up their mission for women and children who were living in extremely poor and vulnerable condition was that the phenomenon of the interconnection between human rights and the extractive sector was absolutely not known. It was really not studied. There were very, very few data available, although we're talking of an area, as I said, where major multinationals have their operations, or from where major multinationals are buying from. But this was totally unknown. It was really underground. So what we discovered, and together with other advocacy groups, including Amnesty, we brought it to the surface, was that there is definitely a prevalence of child labor, and more specifically worse forms of child labor according to the ILO definition in the area. We estimated from the sample that we gathered from our surveys that 70–80% of children were involved in various forms of child labor connected to the extraction of minerals, which is which means extracting or carrying or crushing or spending a day in these toxic pools of water. Extensive, massive numbers of gender-based violence, so a great impact on women's rights. And widespread, as you can see here, environmental damages that were absolutely not even investigated or under control. More recently, there was a publication on Science on the impact on the lungs of these people that breathe the fine powder that comes out of this extraction operations. You have to think that these people that you see here work the tailings. They're not really working in the actual extraction site. These are all tailings, leftovers, mountains of leftovers that have damaged the rivers, the water sources that are the only source of water for the nearby villages. So these people are basically spending hours breathing and trying to sort the waters to extract the necessary minerals. Here you see, these are pictures I've taken last year in October when I visited the project. And you have to think that I've been there quite a few times, and it was still shocking to hear. This was 6 p.m. in the evening, and this lady told me that she'd been there sitting in this pool of water with uranium and copper and cobalt for the whole day, trying to bring together something to be sold then in the informal market to earn a living. So here you see this woman is sifting the water to extract the gray material, which is the cobalt. And as you can see, there's plenty of children doing all kinds of things because the village, it's just right above the hill here. So here, just to give you a few data, which are very, very limited data, because as I mentioned, there are no major and independent researches done to study this phenomenon, despite the fact that there's all this interest. There was an estimate done by UNICEF in 2014 that 40,000 children work in the mining sector in the Katanga area, but we consider this data not entirely reliable. What we've observed, 70% of the children we've began to work with were definitely involved in this, and this had caused all kinds of psychophysical trauma, long-term health hazards. These children and their families are clearly lacking the means to attend school, because school in DRC, it's formally free, at least primary school, but in reality, the families are required to pay fees, so they're not able to afford. And actually, they're caught into a sort of dilemma, because the kids mention that they go to the mines in order to make the money, they need to go to school, but of course they cannot go to school if they are in the mines. And so this vicious cycle, it's impossible to be broken. What we found extremely concerning, and this is still a reality, is the fact that most of these children belong to what we can consider the category of orphans or vulnerable children. 50% of them not having parents or being in the care of an elderly family member. And you have to think that in this whole province, there were no social services available. So no institutions, neither social welfare structures, no social protection system to support this children, especially those living in the remote areas, in the villages that are right on the concessions or near the concessions. The reality of women is no better, unfortunately. Over 70%, 75% of these women report to have been abused, and unfortunately the mining environment is conducive of this level of violence, because very unregulated and extremely volatile, and therefore triggering violent behavior within the groups that are competing for access to the sites. And the women also have a lot of health repercussions, and so there's a lot of death rate at birth, a very high death rate at birth, and health hazards in general for the babies who are born with a number of malformations. Again, something that goes very much underreported. Now, when we started to look at the root causes of this situation, we realized that it's a very complex situation, and the multidimensional situation when it comes to the reasons why for this abuses. Definitely the role of government and the lack of capacity to enforce the little regulation that is available, which has been recently changed, is one of the elements. Huge corruption, it's another element, and collusion between multinationals that have benefited and profited of the privatization of the large public mining company that used to run these sites until the early 90s. That has played a major role in basically creating a sort of anarchy, and the title of the webinar is very apt in this case: the greed of the international let's say economic powers that were interested in this precious commodities really played a major role, combined with high level, unfortunately, of corruption from the local government. So,
Cristina, may I ask you to sum up?
Yes, sure. So to summarize, the questions that we are seeing today is how much in the framework of the responsibility of the corporations under the UN guiding principles on business and human rights can be really enforced effectively, and by whom. We've seen the power, a growing power of consumers and of advocacy groups that are really pushing companies towards more responsible behavior. But we see that unless there is a more, how can I say, effective capacity to control and to do a due diligence that can also look at prevention and remediation, this can even become a side effect. To be too rigid in due diligence can impact the local communities possibly even more than having no regulation at all. I will leave it at that because it seems something provocative, but it's actually what we observe on the ground.
Thank you very much. I think your presentation showed very clear that was what is understood as green mobility or green economy in many parts of the world has nothing to do with green, but with human rights infringements and gender-based violence and the devastated nature. So thank you very much. And I'd like now to hand over to David Donat-Kattin. He's also based in Rome, so maybe you can go for a coffee afterwards. David is Secretary General of the organization Parliamentarians for Global Action, and parliamentary NGO that tries to fight impunity after atrocities, for instance, and tries to uphold human rights and educate MPs on that. And David is a public international law expert, and especially he also focuses on the right to live in a healthy and sustainable environment. David, over to you now.
Thank you very much, Petra, and it's really thanks to you and KOO Austria if we are here. So I would like really to thank you both from the other side of the Alps for having made this possible. I wanted to start this presentation today with an image that really shocked me, and it's the cover of a report that the WWF recently published, making a link between the recent coronavirus outbreak in the world, the so-called pandemic, and the overexploitation of nature And in this report, and I would like Tiago maybe to share the screen with all of us about that report. And page 1 has that shocking picture, but on page 3 you will find a number of messages, key messages, establishing a link between what has been happening in terms of overexploitation of nature, the use of the so-called wet markets in which animals have been brought alive in contact with each other and in close connection with other agents that could be at times become pathogens, and then had apparently, according to science, transmission to the human being. And the report is really worthwhile of reading because it shows that there is a nexus of causality between the way we approach this common good of humankind and the type of consequences we are suffering today in terms of the enjoyment of our day-to-day human rights in all sides of the world, from Brazil to the United States, to Europe, to Bangladesh, to Nigeria and the rest of the world, because we are certainly, our freedoms are certainly compressed by these obligations not to infect each other. This brings us to some legal concepts that I think need to be highlighted, that can be applied in both the situation that have been described today so well by Chantelle and by Cristina. And of course, they are very relevant to the work of parliaments. Of course, the European Parliament is more often than not the avant-garde, maybe because they don't have regulatory legislative powers vis-a-vis a specific territory. They are more sensitive in the European Parliament to international law. And the European Charter of Human Rights, for example, is one of the few legally binding documents that recognize the right to live in a healthy environment, where instead, unfortunately, at the global level, the United Nations and other frameworks have done a lot of declarations, resolutions, frameworks, but there is not black on white this statement of value, which is that we need to protect the environment in which we all live and share in order for the future generation to have hope in the future, and in order for us to have a place respectful of each other. But there are other laws that can be applied to this, and this can be derived from the body of human rights law. The first principle that, in my view, is the most important one in international environmental law is the principle of precaution. So even though that report of the WWF established a lot of scientific basis to link the degradation of nature with the emergence of pathogens like coronavirus, which then can bring about this deadly disease, COVID-19, even though the science would not be deemed as satisfactory as for justifying a new patent or a new technology, if the science is all concordant towards a certain result, then in order not to be making a mistake that could be irreparable, the principle of precaution applies. This is a principle derived from the international law of the sea. It applies to also the international law of the environment. It doesn't apply to other areas necessarily, but at least in these two areas, it means that we don't need to wait until we are absolutely sure, like after Hiroshima, that to destroy everything with a nuclear bomb. And then, of course, Nagasaki came and we knew the exact consequence of what happened. At that point in time, one could say we were not yet sure about the impact of using nuclear weapons. Today, we don't need to be absolutely sure to be held responsible, because under the principle of precaution, if there is reasonable basis in science that certain consequence can have no way to be repaired, not to be brought to the status quo ante, so fully repaired, then we need to put on hold, to pause, to suspend our activities until the day we will be sure that the impact of our activities on the environment will be able to be in line with the protection of the common good. Now, the common good that I was referring to is a principle that has been elaborated in respect of human-made or man-made manufacts, the so-called common heritage of humankind. Since 1972, since the first declaration, the Stockholm Declaration on the protection of the environment, this concept has been applied also to the natural environment, to the framework that pre-exists the human being and human manifacts. These concepts allow us to place the Amazon, the Congo forest and other natural environments under the protection of international law. Now, the question is, what do we do when there are breaches or violations? I think this is the pattern of the interventions that we heard from colleagues, and especially Cristina highlighted how the due diligence notion within the framework of a number of United Nations tools, the due diligence is called for on a voluntary basis. And in and of itself, who is conducting a due diligence exercise? The company itself, the state exploiting the nature itself, the population or the community in charge of willing to create a certain infrastructure. There is not a third-party authority that can intervene and say, stop. If you create this economic energy infrastructure, you will stop the course of the water course over the Nile, and millions of people in Egypt will not have anymore 90% of their fresh waters to irrigate camps and to have an economy that is acceptable, not vibrant, I would say acceptable as of today. Not to mention, of course, the very poor regions of the Sudan that depend 100% from the flow of waters in the Nile. So this law is being, of course, invoked now in the current dispute between Egypt and Ethiopia, but most of the examples that you gave do not belong to state interests today. They should, because under the responsibility to protect the government of the Democratic Republic of the Congo or the federal government of Brazil should protect the rights of children, women, indigenous peoples, any other group living in a society, because what we know for sure is that fundamental human rights, including the principle of non-discrimination, are all applicable in these situations. And when we speak about, for example, child labor, can a child offer any consent to those employing them? They can't. Therefore, those employing them are necessarily exercising property rights of an individual against another individual, a minor, who is reduced in slavery. And enslavement, if conducted on a widespread or systematic basis, as unfortunately in the Katanga or in the Kivus in respect of the coltan exploitation with enormous export that goes via Rwanda and other neighboring countries, all these phenomena are crimes against humanity of enslavement, and they are covered by applicable international criminal law. There is the principle of individual criminal responsibility that applies, which has been now fully implemented in the domestic law of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So here we go. The problem is the one of giving concrete application to these laws that exist but are not enforced, and helping more than even before than looking at trade and other very important issues that absolutely the European Parliament must look in, and I really look forward to reading to the work of the committee where Anna is sitting. I also believe that we need to reorient the work of our peacekeeping operations. These peacekeeping operations, for example, the one assisting the Democratic Republic of the Congo, should focus more on human rights than on just security and resolution of conflict. They should go on the ground and ensure that communities are protected, because after all, if the domestic system is unable or unwilling to protect, you need to have, you have the basis for an international intervention, and we also have the consent of the territorial state. So there is a lot to be done in that respect, and it covers so much of a territory of such a big country, in respect of which we have seen the expression of regrets by the former colonizer, the King of Belgium. But what we need to see more is development cooperation, international intervention, going to the benefit of those who are victims of these human rights violations that more often than not can be characterized as crimes against humanity. Moving
David,
to
may I also ask you to come
Yes.
to an end?
A final point on the indigenous people, and I'm very happy to eventually elaborate later on in the debate. Of course, the indigenous peoples of Amazonia are also protected by international human rights law. I mentioned the principle of non-discrimination. I also would like to mention one particular element of the law of crimes against humanity, which is not part of the federal law of Brazil, because our members of Parliamentarians for Global Action, unfortunately, Orlando Fantazzini and Antonio Carlos Pannunzio and Mario Miranda in the past, who was also the first Minister of Human Rights in the first Lula administration, they didn't manage to get enough support in the parliament to get it passed, but it's there, the draft is there. And the forcible transfer of population, so not the deportation, like in the case of Myanmar, Bangladesh, with the Rohingya being deported from Myanmar into Bangladesh, that's a crime against humanity, but also the forcible deportation of population within the border of the same country is a punishable crime against humanity. So if the attacks on the environment where the indigenous people live is systematic or widespread, if it's carried out with intent and knowledge, then this could also bring about the individual criminal responsibility of those who perpetrate. They may be individuals in this case, in the chain of command of the federal government. They may be individuals who are in charge of companies or businesses. After all, a business takes a decision because a board of individuals takes that decision. So the individual can be made accountable under hard law. We don't need the soft law of the resolution on business and human rights. We can just apply international law as we have it. Of course, the problem is that the system that we have inherited after World War II is that the main actors who are called to apply this law are member states of the United Nations or of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court or other instruments. And that's where we have the missing link. States are not fulfilling their duties under international law for the protection of their people. So they are failing the rights of their people. Certainly, we need to work with you, Chantelle, and our members of parliament in Brazil and elsewhere in the world to remedy the shortfalls in Brazilian law. So the next time we may have a prosecutor they're so active against corruption, and corruption is a terrible offense, but crimes against humanity is a little bit worse because so many children and indigenous people are victims of such exploitation. But there is a legal gap there, in part at least. I'm not really an expert in Brazilian law, but we should try to do our best to fill that gap.
Thank you very much, David. I take from your statement that there is a lot of hard law, robust international law, not even slow, but we really have the problem to enact it, to really bring it to the ground and really make people benefit from it. And that's a challenge for all of us, of course. So as I do not see any questions in the chat, I would raise some others who were posed before. One of those is already Anna mentioned the question of boycott. Is it a good idea to boycott some products, for instance? Cristina, would you think that it makes sense to boycott e-mobility, or what else? How else could we move? How else could we be mobile people? I also would like to ask whether the whole question from business and human rights is not hard law, it's soft law, it's regulations, it's principles, it's guiding principles and whatever, but not really binding law. How do you think, what do you think about, is it possible, is it important to make progress on this or to focus on these issues? And maybe also a question to Anna, and also in linkage with Cristina, there is this EU regulation on mineral conflicts, which should get in force by 1st January next year, so quite soon. And we know that many countries do not have so far any ideas how to really enact it. Germany is one of the good ones. Germany at least has an idea about the law and how it could look like. But do you think that such a regulation could really be helpful and really bring us forward? And maybe a very last question to Chantelle. As far as I know, Brazil ratified the ILO Convention 169, the protection of indigenous people. Can you, that is a kind of tool to protect people there? And sorry, there are a lot of questions now. Whoever would like to start? I see Cristina already unmuted herself, so I start with Cristina.
Sure. I would say that I don't have a final answer to the first question about boycott. I can share what we have observed. So at the first moment when there was this initial movement to uncover the issue of child labor in the battery supply chain, this has put a lot of pressure on companies to start looking at the problem, to become aware of the problem. And so to get in touch with those among us within civil society, NGOs who are trying to independently work on solutions, and we're already on the ground working with the communities. Then there was additional pressure that came out of the OECD guidelines that, as you know, are the only more concrete. It's not hard law, but it's a little bit more specific, and there is peer pressure multilaterally for implementation. What we have observed though from the ground up on the other end is that going down the line of boycotting and having companies ultimately de-risking, finding ways to de-risk, brought to freezing major contracts with providers from these areas. And this, unfortunately, had very bad repercussions on the local communities, because one of the things I didn't mention earlier, but I think those of you who are familiar with this kind of context are aware that these are communities that are gravely victims of what it's called the resource curse, which means these communities only rely on mining and extraction and trade of minerals to survive. There's no alternative livelihoods available. And so if you stop the major contracts, for example, Apple announced right after the amnesty report that they would freeze all contracts with the Chinese trader that is also extracting in these areas, and where there was serious concerns of child labor. This has created a chain of effects that unfortunately has impacted very badly the local community. So in the absence of a strong regulatory government regulation system on the ground, these policies, these acts, unilateral acts from companies might cause more harm than good. And what I explained at the OECD, for example, a couple of years ago, was that companies that then claimed to have done their due diligence and put up remediation system, what they did was just basically fencing in their concessions, throwing kids out of their concessions, and not investing a dollar in creating opportunities for the communities around to remediate the damage and to create systems that could avoid the problems that we have observed. So unless the due diligence system becomes effective through the whole process, so from the local level to the international level, and it's coupled with strong and well-designed policies to invest in development for these communities, the problem will get worse, unfortunately. Only the legal side taken care of, it's probably going to be a boomerang on the communities.
Thank you very much, Anna. I see you also try to respond on that.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think it's a very, very interesting question to debate. And I would also say, like, the boycott question really depends on the situation and on the country. In Brazil, it is of course the case that most of the agricultural activities is done by huge agro businesses. That is the voting basis of Bolsonaro. So, I mean, you have to really look into the different, and I can imagine in the DCR, it's a completely different situation than in Brazil. And there, in this very like specific circumstances, I think it works, and it showed already that it worked, because at least Bolsonaro, I mean, it's more like window dressing, but at least he said he will ban illegal fires for the next 100 and something days, because he got so much economic like pressure. But I completely agree that boycott is not the best tool ever in all the different circumstances, because often it can hit the poorest even more. I mean, this is absolutely true. I think when it comes to electromobility, what we are promoting is, of course, is in general a completely different kind of mobility. So you cannot replace all the cars that are using like the diesel or whatever engines right now one by one with electric mobility. In general, we need much more public transport and a better bicycle system, and so on and so on. So you need a really an entire concept, and not only pushing for e-mobility all the time, but this is of course a bigger picture. What I'm personally also working on in the European Parliament is my other committee is pushing the circular economy agenda, because I mean, you know, at the moment so much resources are still getting like wasted or sitting around in mobile phones. There's millions of old mobile phones sitting around in all the drawers everywhere in our like bedrooms that no one uses, but that contain precious resources. So of course, the question of how can you recycle, how can you design products so that they can be reused and that they last longer, and so on is also part of the bigger picture. When it comes to due diligence, next to this law that I mentioned that the European Parliament is asking for due diligence in deforestation, there is also another process going on, and I'm sure you've heard of it. The European Parliament had demanded several times for like a horizontal due diligence legislation. And now finally the commissioner, like our justice commissioner, Didier Reynders, announced such a legislation for 2021. So we will have a very interesting process in the next months and years on how to design an EU legislation tries to really also tackle the problems and not just being a legal toolbox, but like really tries to be a good legislation. And I think there's some promising signs. For example, in the European Parliament, there's really a cross-group working group that is an informal working group on responsible business conduct, where MEPs from all the different groups, I mean, less conservatives, but like whatever, Social Democrats, left, Renew, Greens, of course, are active and trying to really work on a good horizontal due diligence legislation. And of course, Petra, to your question, I think we will look very closely on the implementation of the conflict mineral legislation, because of course it's one like model, or it's like was the first step on EU level. And when we advocated this horizontal legislation, we always refer to the conflict minerals as the first step, as the example. But I think we have to really also see how it will be implemented and monitor closely if there is like improvements to make or learning lessons to learn from this legislation. And I think it's still a little bit different than the horizontal due diligence legislation that we want. And I think it's good that in commodities where there's a bigger risk or higher risk, that there is even a more specific, sector-specific legislation in place, like with deforestation or like with conflict minerals. So this is my 5 cents in the debate.
Yeah, thank you very much. I saw that David also wanted to unmute himself, so please do that now, David. Thank you.
Yes, yes. I think to respond to your question on what we have available in terms of body of so-called soft law vis-a-vis what we can achieve with the already existing standards, I think we can do a lot, because the Sustainable Development Goals, whatever it's under that umbrella of sustainable development, human development, it's something that is binding the entire international community. Essentially, nobody's objecting to them, and everybody is more or less engaged in their implementation. Some results needs to be brought to light. So I think we can make use of that political agreement. Maybe that political agreement was possible because it's non-binding. It's soft, if you wish. But then if we highlight the situations of those who are exploited on the ground, like our colleagues did today, showing the images of the indigenous peoples, or of the children and women and the civilian population in the DRC, and in other places there is even armed conflict, like in Yemen. In other places there is an enormous amount of victimization, where all the SDGs, ending poverty, are not realizable unless and until the conflict will be put to an end, unless and until there will be a control exercised by the state in question over those territories like Katanga or the Kivus or the Province Oriental or the Amazons, in a way that is conducive to the realization of the human rights which are part of hard law. Because all these non-binding declarations or declarations of principles, they restate legally binding human rights: the right to life, the right to have access to health, or the right to live free of enslavement, torture, inhuman treatment, arbitrary detention, you name them, they are all there. And if you combine them all, you see that they are, and as I said, the other side of the principle of non-discrimination is the crime against humanity of persecution. I would arguably say that the indigenous people of the Amazon currently are under persecution. They are not free to do what they were meant to do in their land. So the persecution is defined as the systematic deprivation of the access to fundamental human rights, all of them, including any discriminatory policy. If connected to other crimes, they can even be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court. So I think there is a pattern of law that is strong enough to support these causes. But maybe what we need to do is to mainstream the perspective of those who suffer, not those who benefit. And maybe the boycotting, since we live in consumer-driven economies, boycotting should be coupled with the support for intervention. Because as a public international lawyer, this is where I see the problem. We don't want to send our best personnel on the ground to stabilize and help to build the rule of law and protect human rights in the areas emerging from conflict. Look at Libya, in the areas emerging from very difficult situations, or in the areas overexploited and also stemming from 25 years of the largest Africa war, like in the African Great Lakes region, which includes the Congo. So we have failed in that because, of course, it entails a human cost. It means that some people will die in the process. From our side, from the side of the international community, we never applied Articles 43, 44, 45, 46, 47 of the United Nations Charter. We never did so. It was drafted in 1945. We never created a joint military force on behalf of the UN to intervene, whether or not there is the consent of the territorial state to stabilize and restore and bring in international peace and security. So we have failed to implement international law as we have it. We had the excuse for 40 plus years of the Cold War. Then there was a lot of euphoria in the 90s to change things. And now we are back to basics with big powers playing again unilaterally with the power politics. But we need to reinvest in multilateral cooperation. Because it's very good that we boycott. It's very good that Hollywood makes movie about blood diamonds, or in the future, blood coltan, blood cobalt, whatever it is, or the protection of the Amazons. But at the same time, when we fight as consumers, as citizens, we want to also have tools that are hard tools that entail the duty to intervene on the ground on behalf of the international community as a whole to protect the common heritage of humankind, or the common good and the rights of not only of the people of today, but also the future generations.
Thank you very much, David. Chantelle, you have as we have to close in 6 minutes, you are the last one now from the panel to respond. And I can't hear you. I see you are unmuted, but try it once more, please. No, something. I saw that you opened your channel, but somehow we do not hear you. I'm so sorry. Try it once more. Or maybe you plug out and in again.
Yes.
I hear you.
Ah, yeah.
Now.
Now it works.
Bom, sobre the ILO 169, o Brasil é signatário da Convenção 169. Ela passou por um procedimento interno de aprovação e desde 2002 ela faz parte do ordenamento jurídico brasileiro, então ela é uma lei brasileira, a Convenção 169. E é interessante que, embora o governo federal, o poder executivo, não respeite esse tratado, o poder judiciário vem tentando implementar ele de alguma maneira. Então, a gente tem decisões favoráveis no judiciário sobre a implementação da Convenção 169. Tiago, não sei se você quer traduzir agora e depois eu continuo.
Yes, let me just give a brief. So yes, Brazil is a signatory of the Convention 169 since 2002, and as curious as it may be, the federal government might not support it, but the judicial power does support it and does honor the convention.
A Corte Interamericana também tem feito um excelente trabalho no sentido de reconhecer principalmente o direito à consulta livre, prévia, informada como um instrumento de autodeterminação dos povos, e ela vem ressaltado as características que esse diálogo que a consulta propõe tem que ter. E uma das características é que a consulta deve ser culturalmente adequada. Então, ela não tem que ser estática e ela não tem que ser implementada pelo Estado e ela tem que respeitar as formas autônomas de organização social e tomada de decisões. Nesse sentido, os povos indígenas do Brasil têm construído os seus protocolos de consulta livre, prévia e informada, que são documentos onde cada povo indígena, baseado em algum território, faz uma apresentação sua e determina como esse diálogo, como a consulta vai acontecer em relação a algum empreendimento que vai afetar os seus territórios.
Okay, let's see if I don't leave anything out.
Okay.
The Inter-American Court has been doing a good job so far in allowing and creating provisions for consultation. And in that aspect, the indigenous population has created its own protocols of consultation, particularly because the court itself encourages the cultural, the consultation to be done in a cultural, devoted or in a cultural, how can I say, yes, in a cultural aspect of support. So it allows for the indigenous population, the indigenous community, to create its own protocols of consultation, and therefore the consultation is done in a more sensitive way towards the indigenous community.
O Poder Judiciário brasileiro reconheceu, a Justiça Federal do Amazonas reconheceu que esses documentos têm caráter jurídico e que seriam documentos juridicamente reconhecidos pelo Estado brasileiro e que, por isso, são vinculados ao processo de consulta. Nesse sentido, o Estado não poderia realizar a consulta sem respeitar esses documentos que são elaborados pelas comunidades e que definem como eles tomam decisões, como eles se organizam socialmente e também reafirmam o poder de veto, de poder vetar medidas do Estado que vão impactar de forma muito grave a sua forma de vida e o seu território.
Yes, so the judicial power, particularly the judicial power of the state of Amazonas, allows for this process to take place in a secure manner, and gives the power to the indigenous people to have a more careful approach, and that allows for the, if I understand correct, for the power of veto and deixei algo de fora? Ou...
A tomada de decisões, a forma como tomam
Yes,
decisões.
the power of decision, the power of choice, it's given to them.
Okay, so thank you very much. As we exhausted our time already, I will try to sum up with five takeaways among a lot of takeaways we should work on and continue our efforts. First of all, I think it's really so important to raise awareness, to build solidarity, and to show, for instance, that everybody is affected if global common goods are under pressure, is such a way how to raise awareness and how to create solidarity. Second, we really should focus on ideas and mechanisms of circular economy, because that really is key for how to use all those resources where the greed now is so huge on, and how we could better handle all these rare earths or materials that we use for all our lives nowadays. Third, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals can be an additional argument when it comes to foster human rights for everybody, because human rights are more or less in all the 169 goals, and we really should use them as something that everybody says, oh, they are so fine, we are convinced that we should live in this direction of the Agenda 2030, then we can tell them, okay, there needs to normative shifts to be done, and one of these normative shifts also includes to change our economic system, because we are aware that with that economy we cannot live in a sustainable world at all. Fourth, I take with me that boycott can build a lot of pressure, but it's not always a one-size-fits-all model for every region and every situation, every country, so that we really have to think about when we use it and how we use it, not to worsen the situation of those people who are now already affected in a bad way. And it's really to nations to take actions to guarantee international law on the spot, because otherwise we also should be aware that multilateralism will fail, because it's up to the national levels and the regional levels as well, really to enact these international law to foster human rights, foster natural protection of nature and of environment. Thank you all much for your participation and for your contributions. I once more want to thank the Austrian mission at the UN in Geneva, who shared their Zoom platform with us to make it happen, this event. I really very much want to thank Anja Appel and KOO staff, who made a lot in the background and provided us with all the technical necessities we need. I also want to thank PGA staff for doing a lot of organizing thing and for translation and other things. And I also want to thank CIDSE and the Federal Ministry for Climate Action, Environment, Energy, Mobility, Innovation and Technology of Austria for being co-hosts of this event. I'd really, really, really love to continue working with all of you and hope that we really can foster our energy and build synergies by cooperating also in the future. And I want to thank you all for your time, for your engagement, and wish you all a lot of power and energy for your common struggles. I'm sure you will have struggles. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye to everybody. And great we had this opportunity this afternoon. Okay.
Bye. Bye-bye.